Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. At UFC Vegas 27, Norma Dumont took on Felicia Spencer in a women's featherweight fight, and I really thought it was worth making a video about. The UFC needs to close down the women's featherweight division. Before I get into all the reasoning behind it, let's go over through a little history of the women's featherweight division. So they originally signed Cyborg to open the featherweight division in the UFC. There was a lot of talk about it for years. People wanted to see Cyborg versus Rousey. Cyborg belonged in the UFC. People were saying she was destroying everyone. And finally, the UFC gave in and signed her. But Cyborg wasn't going to be ready for UFC 208. Now, UFC 208 was originally supposed to be Max Holloway, who was the interim featherweight champion at the time, fighting Jose Aldo, who was the undisputed featherweight champion. But for whatever reason, they couldn't put that fight together. So they decided to do Geraint Durandamine versus Holly Holm for the inaugural women's featherweight belt. So quick side note, if you guys don't realize that, and by the way, this is in 2017, I believe. Neither one of those girls are true featherweights. Both of them are really true bantamweight women's fighters. But the UFC needed a headliner there, and the UFC does not like to do headliners without titles on the line. So they decided to go with Geraint Durandamine versus Holly Holm for the featherweight title. So Geraint Durandamine beat Holly Holm and won. She was the first ever women's featherweight champion. And after that, everybody knew what was next. It was going to be Geraint Durandamine versus Chris Cyborg. Chris Cyborg being the reason that they even opened the division to begin with. So the UFC started looking to schedule JDR versus Chris Cyborg. Well, Geraint Durandamine said, I'm not fighting Cyborg. She's abused PEDs. I'm not going to fight her. So the UFC said, okay, then we're stripping you of the belt. So they stripped Geraint Durandamine in June 2017, and they decided they were going to do Chris Cyborg versus another actual legitimate women's featherweight fighter, Megan Anderson. But Megan Anderson couldn't make the fight. So they said, okay, well, who are we going to have her fight? Because there's very little featherweight talent, and that's what I'm going to get to in a minute. So they decided to sign Tanya Evinger from Invicta, who was, I believe, was the Invicta bantamweight champion at the time. She's a bantamweight fighter. And they made them fight for the vacant women's featherweight belt. So Chris Cyborg destroyed her, won the belt, whatever. But again, it's Chris Cyborg who's the only legitimate featherweight there, fighting Evinger, who's a legitimate bantamweight. So it's again the talent's not there. So then Chris Cyborg goes on to her first title defense. She fights Holly Holm, beats Holly Holm by decision. Again, another bantamweight. So they're paying these girls to naturally fight at 135 to move up to 145 and fight Chris Cyborg. So she moves up. She loses to Chris Cyborg. So they say, okay, well, who's Chris Cyborg going to fight next? There's not anybody there. They don't have any talent. So they signed another Invicta bantamweight. Yana Kutsikaya, I believe is how you pronounce her name. Chris Cyborg goes out there, beats her pretty easily. And they're like, okay, what are we going to do with this division now? So this is when they finally book the only legitimate women's featherweight fight in history. We got Chris Cyborg versus Amanda Nunes. Now, Amanda Nunes is a 135-pounder, but she is on the big side. She does have a little bit of trouble making the weight, but she makes it no problem. But also, she's the best of the best. We've seen Amanda Nunes for years now. She's super dominant at bantamweight. So this was like a really fun fight, and the size advantage wasn't as massive as Cyborg had over these other girls. So we all know what happened in that fight. Amanda Nunes goes out and KOs Chris Cyborg. Now, after this fight, there was a lot of talk. Do the Cyborg versus Nunes rematch. It was a crazy fight. Nunes just picked her shots and just finished her early. It was a beautiful finish by Nunes. Cyborg was super aggressive, but people were saying, let's see the rematch. Maybe Cyborg can take a different approach. This was the first time that Cyborg went out there and didn't have somebody on the other side that she could just steamroll for the most part. Holly Holm is kind of that. But for the first time, Cyborg met some resistance and Nunes knocked her out in the first round, which was just absolutely incredible. Beautiful knockout. But Cyborg had some type of negotiating issues with the UFC. We don't know all the details. And Cyborg fought one more fight against Felicia Spencer, and then she wanted out of her contract, and the UFC released her from her contract. Or actually, I think I think she fought out her contract and the UFC decided not to re-sign her. Something like that. I don't remember the exact details of it. So Cyborg now is gone. The one legitimate featherweight that the UFC opened the division for, she's gone within, a little over a year or 2 years after they opened the division. So this is how much the UFC values the women's featherweight division. From December of 2018, when Nunes became champion, to June of 2020, over a year and a half, there was not a single women's featherweight title defense, and the division was not logjam at all. Almost 2 years, and that's being a little bit exaggeratory because it was a year and a half, but a very long time without a title defense at the featherweight division. She was defending the bantamweight title. As you know, she's the double champion. So that's how little the UFC values that. So after that, Nunes goes on to fight Felicia Spencer in June of 2020. Felicia Spencer is a legit 145er, but, I mean, the talent level is just, there's such a massive discrepancy. Then Nunes goes on to fight Megan Anderson earlier this year, and subs her in the first round, hurts her, gets the submission in the first round, just dominant performance. Then the UFC releases Megan Anderson as well. So the point is, there's literally no talent in the women's featherweight division. At this point, they're just giving bums to Amanda Nunes to beat up at 145 for what reason? I mean, is anybody, honestly excited to see her in another featherweight, title fight? I'm not. I never get excited for it. I was not excited for the Megan Anderson fight at all. I knew Nunes was going to go out there and stomp her, and she did. And, I know Nunes has her next fight. It's at bantamweight against Juliana Pena. But they still have not, said anything about possibly just getting rid of the women's featherweight division. If you go on the UFC's website, and they have the rankings on their website, the women's featherweight division, there's nobody. There's just the champion. There's no rankings. There's no actual division. I don't even know how many, women's featherweight fighters they even have. They had Norma Dumont versus Felicia Spencer. Dumont won last, at UFC Vegas 27. I don't know if that's who would be next in line, but Nunes would just absolutely destroy them. And what's the fun in that? I mean, Nunes is just collecting easy paychecks, easy legacy. They're going to say she's double champ, but really, other than that Chris Cyborg fight, there's nothing she's done at featherweight that's been super impressive. These girls are just not on her level. They're in a, totally different skill level. They should be off in other organizations. I don't believe they're UFC caliber at all. The bantamweight division is okay. Juliana Pena deserves to fight for the bantamweight title, and I think it'll be semi-interesting. I know Nunes is considered the GOAT, and she is a great fighter, so she does make a lot of these girls look bad, but the featherweight division is just non-existent. And for a company in the UFC who thought about canceling men's flyweight a couple years ago, I just think it's ludicrous that they're keeping this featherweight division around. I truly believe the only reason the UFC is keeping that division around is because sometimes they need an extra title fight on a card to kind of build it up, and they can say, oh, we got 3 title fights. If you ever notice, when the UFC does 3 title fight cards, it's always one of those like Nunes featherweight fights on that card. It's not a 3 amazing title fights. So it's just crazy. But do yourself a favor, go look at the rankings on the website. Nothing exists. And they wanted to cancel the men's flyweight, which had a legitimate top 10. You could even probably had a top 15. I wouldn't doubt back when they were thinking about canceling. You had legitimate talent. You had Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson as champion. And they thought about canceling that division and getting rid of that division, which was absolutely crazy in my opinion. I love that division. I'm so happy that it's still around. I can't wait for Davison Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno at UFC 263. But right now what's going on there is just, I don't find it fun. I find it almost like, some off-brand, third-party MMA promotion with these weird fights with these girls that are just not on her level, and they're not. And the fights that have been decent skill level, like Nunes versus Holly Holm, these girls aren't legit 145ers. The UFC's paying them to go up to 145 and fight for the belt. Now, I would have loved to seen Amanda Nunes versus Chris Cyborg too. I would have loved to seen them fight 5 times over. Maybe Nunes would have won all 5 of them, but at least it would have been, borderline 2 legitimate 145-pounders. But let me know in the comments, what do you think? Should the UFC get rid of this division? I really think they should. There's nothing to be had. Does anybody, am I crazy? Does anybody get excited to hear Amanda Nunes is defending her featherweight title? Because I don't at all. The competition just isn't there. The skill level isn't there. The division just does not exist. So make sure to like the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.